On the G20, Professor Geoffrey Garrett from the US Studies Centre at the Sydney University has written a paper on tensions between China and America, and he argues that the G20 will be important in managing them. Professor Geoffrey Garrett joins us now from Sydney. Professor, thanks for your time. Before we get to your views on China, the United States and the G20, I want to get your view on Kim Beazley, his appointment as the new ambassador to the United States. Is it a good one?
I think it's an excellent appointment for Australia. Washington is a status town, and Kim Beazley is a very high-status guy. He's also somebody who's personally invested a lot of time in cultivating relationships in Washington, really for more than 2 decades, and he's an expert on the war on terrorism. So I think it's a fantastic appointment for Australia.
What will be his key focus, his major challenges in the years ahead during his posting, do you think?
Well, in the short term, I guess it's all going to be about a broad economic agenda, the kind of things that are going to be on the table at the Pittsburgh G20 next week, so financial reform, but also trying to forge a climate change consensus, thinking about reviving global trade. But Beazley's expertise is more in the national security field, so this sort of vexed issue of what the US and Australia should do with respect to the Afghanistan war, I think is going to be on the table for a long time, and it's an area where Kim's expertise is extraordinary.
It follows the announcement of President Obama's appointment of ambassador to Australia. Does that explain the timing of Mr. Rudd's announcement this week, do you think?
You know, they're probably coincidental, but I would say I have the pleasure of knowing a little bit both Kim Beazley and Jeff Bleich, the President Obama's nominee to the Canberra job, and they're extremely high-quality people, high intellect, high integrity, great respect in each other's countries. So I think that, you know, the US-Australia relationship is on rock-solid footing, but these two ambassadors can only improve matters.
And you think the two leaders have made these appointments in a way to show how serious they are about the alliance?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think on the Australian side, that's clear. When you have a former Deputy Prime Minister and the last leader of the governing party in Washington, that's a pretty heavy commitment. On the US side, there tend to be a lot more political appointees to these ambassadorial roles. All I can say in this case is that Jeff Bleich is an extremely high-quality individual, so it does speak well, I think, of President Obama's view of the importance of the alliance.
Geoffrey Garrett, you've just written a paper entitled Chimerica about the China-America relationship post the global recession. Now, you point to the G20 as a means for Australia to manage that relationship. Explain why.
Well, the US and China have an incredibly intense bilateral relationship, but they've made it clear that they want to nest their bilateral relations in a multilateral framework. And I think the G20 is emerging for both of them as the preferred multilateral framework. And that's very good news for Australia, because Australia is not only in the G20, it's already a respected member of that organisation. And I think it's likely, not only at this meeting, but in the coming years, that really the G20 will be at the centre of global governance where the economy is concerned.
And you've suggested as well in this analysis that the GFC, the economic downturn, has, if anything, exacerbated the imbalances in that China-America relationship. Why is that?
Well, it's not what the economists expected. People thought that declining demand for Chinese imports in the US would sort of reduce these imbalances themselves. The US-China economic relationship is literally the largest and most imbalanced in human history. What's happened in the crisis, however, is that today, the US trade deficit in total has declined, but a greater percentage of it is with China. So literally half of the US's trade deficit with the whole world is with China today. And despite the fact that China's been grumbling about its dollar investments, over the past 12 months, China has bought an additional $250 billion or so of American public debt. So rather than getting reduced, the imbalances, I think, have been exacerbated by the crisis.
You've warned about the prospect of a damaging spiral of dueling US-China economic nationalism. How much of a worry is that, and how broad are the potential implications of such a duel?
Well, I think it's very real, and the prospect is very real, and you only need to look at events of the past week. We've seen an escalation in trade tensions between the two countries. President Obama took the unprecedented step of imposing tariffs on Chinese tire imports into the U.S., not because China was violating any trade rules, but simply because Chinese producers were so competitive they're dislocating the American economy. China retaliated immediately, saying that things like Buy American provisions in the U.S. stimulus package are adversely affecting Chinese exporters, and grumbling about American agricultural subsidies, something Australia can empathise with. So trade issues are a big deal. I think they're going to be tough, but now they're not the only ones. The kind of investment problems, foreign investment problems that Australia has had with China in the recent past, Chinalco, Rio and all that, is likely to be played out in the US, I think, on a bigger scale in the coming years as well. So yes, the US-China economic relationship is both extremely important and, I think, relatively fragile at the moment.
Well, it's such an important trading partner for Australia, China. Of course, the United States, our key military alliance. How precarious then is this circumstance? The projections, the forecast that you're making, how precarious is this for Australia's foreign policy?
Well, I think it's fair to characterise Australian foreign policy over the last couple of decades under both Liberal and Labor governments as executing very successfully a balancing act in which Australia has become much more tightly tied to China economically, while, if anything, its security or relationship with the US has been strengthened. So there are going to be challenges to both of those things going forward. On the China side, it is going to be about foreign investment in the mineral sector, I would suggest. On the US side, President Obama probably wants to keep America's global engagement, but to do it at a lower cost, and that probably means asking more of allies like Australia. But there's a third leg to that triangle, and the third leg is this US-China direct relationship. So if all of that stuff is very important to Australia, and I believe it is, that's why I think the G20 is important, because that's a forum that all three of those countries are pretty committed to today.
The President of the United States announced a change in policy when it comes to the controversial missile shield in Europe. What did you make of it, and how significant is the shift in priorities?
I think it's a pretty significant story, but of course this is really a rehashing of an old problem, which is how is the US going to respond to the breakup of the Soviet Union? What the US did was to allow many of the former communist countries to enter the NATO alliance, but to keep Russia out. President Bush said that he was going to protect Western Europe, the US, and Eastern Europe by putting a missile shield into Eastern Europe. That alienated the Russians. Today Obama has reversed that, so I'm sure it's being celebrated in Moscow, but the former communist countries of Eastern Europe are not very happy about it.
Just finally, Jimmy Carter, the former president, had some comments to make about recent criticism of President Obama. He says there's a foundation of racism underlying that criticism. Do you agree? And why has the current president, not made too much of a comment about it all?
Well, former President Jimmy Carter is considered in US parlance a bit of a loose cannon. He says a lot of things that are way outside the mainstream. I actually don't think that Obama's problems in the US have much to do with race at the moment. They have to do with the fact that Americans are not feeling very good about their economy, and they're starting to blame Obama for it, and they're saying that his additional big-ticket items like healthcare and climate change are just too expensive. So the guild is off the Obama lily at the moment. I don't think it's about race. And I just finally say that one remarkable thing about Barack Obama is, both on the campaign trail and in his presidency, his race is a clear fact every time you see him, but he never talks about it.
That's right. That certainly is noticeable, particularly in the last week. Professor Geoffrey Garrett, as always, appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thanks, Kieran.